We agree with much of what the affirmative has advanced in their first speech, but we do not believe that affirming the resolution is an adequate or appropriate response to the challenges of cultural diversity in a globalized world. Culture is life. Culture is a medium through which we express ourselves, but voting affirmative asks the state to determine which of those expressions are deemed appropriate. The resolution asks us whether states should maintain policies that they deem to be appropriate for the protection of the diversity of cultural expressions on their own territory. But no, states should not get to determine what are appropriate cultural expressions, and this is why we negate the resolution. In order to prove that state-sanctioned culture does not advance the cause of cultural diversity, we need to explain two very significant disadvantages to the position. First, that state protection harms cultural diversity, and second, that these measures actually derail global free trade. First, cultural diversity is a reason to negate the resolution. I'd like to briefly address the affirmative's claims regarding commercialization and capitalism. The affirmative's position should be one that is understood in the context of the UNESCO Convention on Cultural Diversity, from which the language of the resolution is drawn. Voting affirmative does not affirm culture in the abstract, free from the harsh grasp of commercialization or surplus value, but rather they affirm the rights of states like the US, France, Canada, or Russia to determine what cultures are authentically American, French, Canadian, or Russian, and they authorize those states to develop policies to protect and promote those cultural expressions. Professor of Law at the University of Edinburgh, Rachel Crawford Smith explains the range of which these support policies. She explains that the Convention endorses assistance that can be read as covering the whole gamut of often controversial support measures such as transmission quotas, financial subsidies, tax relief, preferential access to distribution facilities, or advertising resources, and investment or ownership restrictions. Clearly, the protection and promotion of cultural expression is just as embodied in the commoditized, commercialized framework that the affirmative criticizes. Dr. Robert Albro, professor of anthropology at the American University, explains how this is the case. He states, for UNESCO, since diversity is subject to scarcity, it must be managed. Diversity becomes a kind of inventory of cultural content that is potentially extractable from any context. We note that diversity understood as a matter of access to resources that fits snugly with the basic concept of global capital, the extraction of surplus value. Diversity becomes transformed into a regulated sphere of activity that creates and empowers a new bureaucracy of cultural workers, charged with managing a concept of diversity better harmonized with the market interest of nation-states. The affirmative will not be able to explain how transmission quotas resolve the alienation and isolation caused by global capitalism, because they simply don't. What's more, if the government can decide the value of cultural expression, these decisions will always exclude as much as they protect. State-sanctioned cultural expressions result in the devaluing of minority cultures. Italian culture could easily be defined to exclude Roma culture, or Tibetan culture might be eliminated in favor of Han cultural expression. Professor J.P. Singh, Associate Professor of Georgetown, explains this further. All cultures contain power hierarchies that marginalize the concerns of minorities and women. UNESCO must entrust governments to discourage cultural diversity within their borders, but oftentimes governments themselves are the worst culprits in this respect. The affirmative's reference to the Olympics is actually an apt example of this process. You see, the Russian national pride displayed in the opening ceremonies is a cultural expression deemed appropriate by the Russian state. State-sanctioned cultural expressions and the vision of the affirmative is the Sochi cartoon bear. The problem is that these expressions exclude, sometimes even violently, non-sanctioned cultures, minorities, or other groups to be considered foreign. For Sochi, LGBT groups and ethnic minorities were just not deemed appropriate. The affirmative gives license to all nations to conduct similar state-sanctioned exclusions. In fact, Dr. Albro explains that we should have reason to be suspicious of national cultural projects, as historically they have mounted regular assaults on the internal diversity of states in the interest of the nation. We need only recall a widespread and centuries-long strategy of nation-building where assimilous narratives were used to culturally imagine nationhood as a unitary subject with a sharply defined citizenry. But in the process, cultural minorities are often find themselves to be spatially incarcerated. One serious question about the Cultural Diversity Treaty is whether UNESCO can address the historical disenfranchisement of cultural minority communities worldwide. Globalization offers more cultural freedom to minorities because they control the means and outcome of cultural production. And second, the convention impedes global free trade. Another implication of their position is that countries should be allowed to maintain protectionist barriers in the case of cultural goods and services. The affirmative position, which is codified in the UNESCO Convention on Cultural Diversity, goes in the opposite direction of trade liberalization. The convention creates ever-expanding groups of economic sectors that will not be considered in trade negotiations, which we say is problematic. Pierre Schwab of Harvard and Karsten Steinfeld of Organization of American States explain that creating ambiguous exceptions for cultural expression risk being used as a guise for protectionism. They write that because of its fluid nature, a concept like cultural diversity could easily become the favorite veil used to disguise protective measures, in turn requiring the international trading system to indulge clearly protectionist policies on the ground that they aim to promote domestic culture would dilute the considerable economic advantages derived from the World Trade Organization and the pursuit of free trade ideals. The UNESCO Convention's exclusion of entire industries is a massive blow against the promise of progressive trade liberalization, e.g. the shared commitment of World Trade Organization members to put all of their protectionist policies on the table and in hopes of their eventual elimination. Global free trade holds the promise of improving economic conditions worldwide. However, the affirmative asks you to set these gains aside in favor of protectionism that supports state-sanctioned culture. We think that this is a bad idea, not only for developed countries like the US, but also for those in the developing world, who stand to gain the most from the reduction of trade barriers. Thus, we urge you to reject the resolution and the idea that countries should have a free pass to take protectionist and xenophobic actions in the name of cultural diversity. Thank you.